Hi everyone. As Catherine pointed out, I'm Kristen from the CTU, and for those of you who don't know, the CTU is the Council of Trade Unions, and we have 40 affiliate unions, some of which are here today, and within that we represent almost 350,000 workers across New Zealand, so that it makes us one of the largest democratic institutions within New Zealand. So the CTU takes an interest in anything that affects workers, whether it's health and safety or minimum employment standards, and obviously with the health and safety law changes that are about to come in, we're dedicating a lot of our time and resources to health and safety as an issue, and fatigue within that. So the sort of overview of my presentation is that, that we know that there's this thing called fatigue, and we know that it causes accidents and injuries. But I'm going to sort of unpick a bit more what causes fatigue, and then what the CTU and our affiliates think we can do about it. And I don't propose to give you specific tools and things that you can use, because we haven't developed them as the CTU, but just a systemic approach overall of what we should be looking at and what direction we should be heading in. So I'm probably preaching to the converted, given that you're all here to talk about fatigue, but what we do know in New Zealand is that we've got an appalling record on health and safety. That's why we've got these new laws coming in. We do know that we've got a significantly higher rate of injury and fatalities than our overseas counterparts. We know that 51 workers died at work last year. We also know that occupational disease is a huge killer in New Zealand, with about 600 to 900 estimated deaths from occupational disease every single year. But what we don't seem to know, and what we don't do as well, is the health and safety. And within that, what type of, or what level of contribution fatigue has to that injury and disease and fatality toll. Within that, you also have other psychosocial stresses that may be contributing towards that. And we don't seem to have robust research and evidence targeting the sort of health and safety at the moment. So this thing called fatigue, and there's various efforts to define what fatigue is. We know it's more than this feeling of tiredness. It's more than just you had a late night and you come to work the next day being tired. It's a phenomenon, and we know it exists. One of the ways we know that it exists is that we legislate for it. So our current health and safety law defines a hazard as fatigue, whether it's mental or physical. And it's included, and once it becomes a fatigue, you obviously have duties to manage that hazard. We've got specific legislation within the transport industries about working hours and maximum driving times. But we've also got internationally recognised and researched papers on fatigue, and it's linked to the accidents and injuries. Some of that research includes a PhD paper I just read from Dr. Margaret Chan. She's in Australia, and she has found that within the construction industry, she's found that the most significant risk factor in workplace accidents is fatigue. And her research identified that previously identified factors like failure to follow safe procedures or use equipment properly, that's all underlined and heavily influenced by fatigue. So if you can manage fatigue and eliminate fatigue from your workplace, you're also eliminating other so-called causes of accidents. We've got some other research in New Zealand. A lot of research into fatigue comes from the hospital and health sector. That's across the board. There's a lot of research in the UK about doctors and surgeons in particular, but in New Zealand we've studied anaesthetists, and 86% of anaesthetists that responded to the survey report making a fatigue-related error sometime during their career. In the United States, the US National Transport Board implicates driver fatigue in 30 to 40% of their serious heavy trucking accidents. And about 70% of Swedish locomotive engineers report having dozed off while they're driving trains. In the United States again, they estimate that fatigue is a contributing factor in 20% of all workplace accidents and incidents across all sectors. So that's not just your physically demanding jobs, that's your office workers, that's across all sectors, and 20% of injuries and accidents have involved fatigue. Another example, this was within New Zealand, found that police officers on the front line are more likely to be injured or killed if they are fatigued. And I guess my question would be, why would the construction industry be any different? If this is the research across the board that fatigue is going to cause accidents, why would construction be any different? And it's my opinion that the construction industry needs to take it really seriously. We also have in New Zealand some construction industry specific research. So this graph, I'm sure you probably can't read it, but it comes from a report that the Department of Labour did in 2007, and they were doing some research into seasonality. So why do we have more accidents in summer than any other season? And part of that report, they looked at what sort of factors were causing the fatalities, and in the construction industry in particular, they found a lack of recovery from fatigue was significantly correlated with the construction industry. In the same report, they also found that, having done a review of all the international research, that there's strong independent evidence supporting that a lack of recovery from fatigue is significantly correlated with accidents. Other research that we have in New Zealand is a survey that the Council of Trade Union does. One of the functions of the Council of Trade Unions is to provide training to health and safety representatives. And I think the Council of Trade Unions has trained almost 40,000 health and safety representatives across New Zealand, and they do that for health and safety reps whether they're part of a union or not. So we did a survey of our health and safety reps. 1,204 of them responded, and that was across a range of industries and occupations. As I say on the slide, 57% of them were members of a union and 43 were not, but 50% of those across all the industries and occupations, 50% believed fatigue contributed to injury or illness at work. One of my other sort of pet hobbies at the moment is the forestry industry. It's something I've been really involved with since joining the CTU, and as some of you might be aware, the forestry industry has a horrific injury and death toll, particularly last year, and as a response to that, the industry got together and decided that they'd fund a review into what was going on in the industry, and out of that has come an interim report. Within that report, there are a lot of things that are identified as possibly contributing to, towards the sort of accident and fatality rate, but fatigue is specifically focused on as causing impairment. And what they say is that 78% of workers reported that they experienced fatigue at least sometimes, and that near-miss injury events were significantly more common among those reporting a high level of fatigue at work. Part of the consultation process for this report and what the CTU has been doing in response to it was to get a group of forestry workers together down in Wellington from all across New Zealand, and I sort of chaired that meeting, and it was the first real exposure I had had to just a group of workers like that, and we were just sort of chatting and bouncing ideas off each other about what some of the issues in the forestry industry was, and one of the chaps who's actually sitting right next to me said, you know, I think fatigue contributes to most, if not all, of the accidents in the forestry industry, at least in one way or another. And that sort of ties into some research that the forestry panel have found, and that's these forestry workers that are in the bush every day are using essentially the same energy as running a marathon every single day. So if you're running a marathon sort of one day after another for 6 days in a row, of course you're going to be fatigued, and towards the end of the week you are going to be less aware of your environment, and you are going to be more likely to have accidents and be a hazard essentially. So that was just interesting to me to hear that coming straight out of a worker. He acknowledged that yes, there were times he shouldn't have been in the bush when he was feeling fatigued. So how we sort of respond to that, I guess, is the next sort of series of my slides. So I hopefully, and I'm possibly already preaching to the converted, that there is this thing called fatigue, and this thing called fatigue causes accidents and illnesses and injuries. But like all workplace matters, it seems that the answer, well, that's not the end of the line. We have to look a bit further. So the next sort of series is about what causes fatigue. We've heard from speakers this morning that a lack of sleep causes fatigue, and that's certainly part of it, but I just sort of want to unpick that a bit further. What causes a lack of sleep? What's driving the causes of fatigue? So I'm going to again come back to the Forestry Review Panel, the Health and Safety Representative Surveys, construction industry, coal mining, to go through it. So there's sort of two questions I'd like you to keep in mind as we go through it is why are workers coming to work fatigued, and also why is work making them fatigued, because both are an issue. So this came from, I think, the Australian fatigue guidelines, and this is what they felt were the main drivers of fatigue in the workplace. And one of the main emphasis that they make is that it's not just about the number of hours that you're working over time. You have to look more specifically at the work environment. So when are those hours being worked? Is it shift work? Is it night work? Because those things bring in particular hazards. So you're more likely to be injured and fatigued if you are doing night work. Things like demands of work tasks. So it's already been said this morning, if you're doing repetitive work or static work at one place, that's equally as fatiguing as something that's physically or cognitively demanding. There's fatigue critical tasks like driving or working at heights or electrical work. But there's also things like extended exposure to hazards. So are you constantly having loud noises blasted at you? Is there a lot of vibration within the jobs that you're doing? Are you outside in the sun all day, or are you in the freezing cold all day? All of those are sort of fatiguing factors. But beyond the sort of work tasks, there's also what information that you have about your job, what instruction you have, what training you've been given. So how efficient are you on your job? Because if you're working inefficiently, you're more likely to become fatigued. What supervision do you have? Is your manager or your supervisor encouraging you to take breaks and recognising signals of fatigue? If you do, then you're managing it properly and you're less likely to be a risk at work. But if not, that can be a serious problem. Organisational factors are a big one, and I think this is another one that's quite a problem in the forestry industry. Something like facilities at work can make a real difference to whether you can manage your fatigue appropriately. So what is available for your workers when they are having a rest? Do they have somewhere where they can sit down? Do they have somewhere where they can adequately eat? And do they have enough water given and available to them if they're working in the bush? I mean, there's no tap and running water normally. Has there been provision of water? Has there been provision of facilities? What type of work culture do you have? Do you have a culture where people can say, hey, I'm feeling fatigued, I need to stop and take a break? Or do you have a culture that says, just carry on, mate, you'll be right? We see it all the time, particularly with accidents, that, you've tweaked your ankle. Oh, but don't worry, it's not a problem, just push through it, whereas you might be doing more damage. We see it all the time in ACC cases, and how that can be a problem. What type of flexibility of work hours does the worker have, and what type of deadlines do they have? Are they constantly under pressure, or do they have flexibility and control over their work demands? One that's also been brought up before is travel time. That's hugely important when you're thinking about work hours and fatigue. Are they driving for 3 or 4 hours before they even get to work? And are they leaving at 4 o'clock in the morning and starting at 9? And if so, when are they having their first break? Have they driven for 3 hours, started work, and then not had a break until 10 or 11 in the morning? On top of that, you then have all the individual factors. So what personal commitments does the person have? What are their family responsibilities? Do they play sports? What other activities do they do? But also, how do they respond to fatigue? And what's their sleep like, as Delwyn's talked about this morning? Another one is the season. That kind of ties into a lot of them, like extended exposure to hazards. So in summer, is it too hot? Or in winter, is it too cold? All of those can have an impact on fatigue. And that means all of those things need to be considered when you're figuring out a program for managing fatigue in your workplace. So if we turn to, again, the Forestry Safety Panel report, they found that the main causes of fatigue arise from the physical and mental demands of work scheduling, including the long commute to the forest block, long work days, including times when the workers are biologically programmed to sleep, so usually first thing in the morning, and the harsh or uncomfortable environment and weather conditions which tire workers. So again, in the middle of summer, are they out in the bush in the 30+ degree weather? Or in winter, is it really windy or is it really cold? Again, facilities like we've talked about, do they have somewhere where they can change their wet clothes and eat their food, or are they just sort of out in the bush and they might have a break, but do they just have to sit on a tree stump? Hydration and nutrition, that I guess ties back into the facilities, but also rest breaks. When are they being taken? Are they being taken? Other parts of the panel's report talks about fatigue appearing over time. So these chaps in the forest, they're strong, tough guys. They can usually handle the physical demands of the job, but doing that day in, day out becomes fatiguing. So while they are strong, robust chaps, that's, you know, doing that day in, day out is a lot for anyone. And if we come back to the Health and Safety Rep survey, we asked them what the cause of the majority of incidents causing injury or illness in their workplace was, and some of the comments, they sort of had a chance to just write in whatever they felt. This was some of the comments that came out of it. So long hours of work, night shifts 7 days a week, stress due to shift work, fatigue and stress, particularly as fewer and fewer workers are required to do more and more work, unreasonable deadlines, unrealistic performance expectations. So that's very consistent across all the research we've looked at. So if I now take some of those hazard factors and sort of consider them a little bit closer. And I know we've heard this morning that just fixing working hours isn't the solution to managing fatigue, but what I'd suggest is it's just one of the many ways we can look at managing fatigue. So if we start with working hours in New Zealand, the OECD defines standard working hours as 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Monday to Friday, but in New Zealand, about 63% of employed people only do those hours, but if you come down to self-employed people, less than 50% of people are doing those hours. And in New Zealand, these statistics are a little bit hard because they also take into account part-time work, so the averages are a little skewed, but at least 1/4 of employed people are working really long hours. And when you compare that internationally, New Zealand is a very poor performer in terms of long hours of work. Of the 36 countries considered in this report, we are number 28 in terms of the hours of work that we do. There's a question about whether we want to work these long hours. I haven't been able to identify any research in New Zealand that addresses that, but what I have found is a lot of research in the UK where they take working hours quite seriously. And in the UK, they've found that 1.4 million employees do long work hours, but of those, only 1 million, of those, 1 million would like to reduce their hours. So there's only 0.4 million people who want to do those long hours that they are, but the majority would much rather decrease them. In the construction industry, there's, according to the research, 171,000 people who work in the industry, roughly 40,000 workers doing evening work and 8,000 doing night work. So that means about 25 to 30% of the workers in the construction industry are working non-standard hours. So that means work hours is something you have to look at when you're thinking about fatigue. There's research to suggest that risk of injury is 30% higher on the night shift compared with the morning shift, and it's higher in the first few hours of the morning. When you do successive night work, your risk is exponentially higher. There's also research on shift length. So the longer into your shift, you can see just from the sort of line of the graph that the longer you go, the more likely you are to have an accident. So why are we doing these long hours? Is it because of productivity? Well, we've heard already this morning that it's not. So long hours don't necessarily mean productivity. And for example, as I say there, the UK works the longest hours in the European Union, but they're 10th in terms of productivity per hour of 15. We in New Zealand work long hours and we have quite low productivity, and we have notably low productivity in construction. And as we've also heard, this fatigue is resulting in increased absenteeism and higher staff turnover, and that again feeds into productivity. So we've identified a serious problem here, and we're working long hours, and we know that causes fatigue, and we know that working long hours isn't even necessarily good for business. There's international research to suggest we don't want to be working these long hours. So what sort of protections do we have in place at the moment? And I looked at the sort of statutory basis for protecting workers and ensuring that they have some kind of mechanisms for dealing with fatigue. So if you're an employee, there's employment law and other various pieces of legislation that mean you get annual leave, you get sick leave, obviously you get paid. And what I found when I looked at that, because of changes that we've recently had to the Holidays Act, employees can now cash in some of their annual leave. Annual leave is it's your rest and recuperation time, and now we have a whole bunch of employees cashing in their annual leave. That's another mechanism for managing fatigue taken away. And a survey's just recently been done, I think it came out about a month ago, about the implication of the changes in the law, and it found that for the employers that did allow this cashing in, some didn't of course, but for the employers that did allow the cashing in of annual leave, the employers and the employees were going beyond what the law permitted. Currently it only lets you cash in 1 week, but it found that some employers were permitting cashing in of 4 weeks, your entire entitlement of annual leave. So that's no rest breaks or annual breaks for these employees to recuperate. There's a huge question about whether employees are allowed to take sick leave for fatigue, and there's a huge question about how overtime gets paid and whether that is used as days in lieu or whether that's paid as you go. And all the way that that's structured impacts on the way you're managing fatigue. We also have, in New Zealand, we've got the Wages Protection Act, which says that in New Zealand we should have a standard working hour of 40 weeks. A standard working week of 40 hours. In New Zealand, that's it's certainly not enforced, and there's no mechanism to enforce that, but that's in breach of our ILO requirements, where we are supposed to be policing that. So we've signed up to an international convention saying we won't be working more than 40 hours a week. It's really weak comparing that to the European Union, where the countries signed up to the European Working Time Directives have a standard, well, theirs is 48, a standard working week of 48 hours, and to do anything other than that, there's mechanisms built in so that you can work more than that, but you have to have advice about it. You have to write and have a written opt-out of that working time directive, and that's something we don't have in New Zealand. So we know that there's this problem, and it's got serious implications, and that is multifactorial in cause, and some causes some of these multifactorial causes are multifactorial in and of themselves. And we've also said that the current protections don't work and that they're ineffective. And then for the majority of our workplaces in New Zealand, there's limited or no formal mechanisms in place to prevent and manage fatigue and keep workers safe. Of course, that doesn't apply to all businesses. We've heard from Downer this morning where there's been some great work done. So what can we do? There we go. What can we do? I loved this quote. It's Sir Winston Churchill. He's saying you need to take off your clothes and get into bed. That's what he always does. You will be more effective and you'll essentially get 2 days out of one. And now I'm not advocating that we all take our clothes off and get into bed, because I don't necessarily think that's the solution either. But where do we start? And overall, we think that we need to talk about maximum work hours. And I'm not saying we all need to only do 40 hours a week, but we need to talk about whether we want people working 60, 70, 80 hours a week. If we have that conversation and we agree that we do, well then perhaps we need to think about what tasks within that job we should consider limiting. Are there certain tasks that we shouldn't be doing for more than 2 hours in a row or more than half an hour in a row? We need to look at whether we really need shift work or night work and whether we really do need long hours. We have to make sure people are given their rest breaks. We have to make sure that travel time is taken into account when we're thinking about work hours. We also have to think about wages and how they're assessed. So what are driving the long hours? Is it because people can't afford an adequate standard of living? Are they working 60 or 70 or 80 hours a week because they can't afford to do anything else? And we need to set wages appropriately. We also have to make sure people have days off, not just when they're feeling fatigued, but to make sure that they have a rest break and come back to work feeling rejuvenated. I won't go through this. But more importantly than that, I think we also need a change in culture. And we need leadership in this space. So the construction industry needs to take a leading role in this, same with head contractors and employers, and there needs to be responsible contracting throughout the supply chain. Obviously I'd like to speak to this more, but I'm very quickly out of time. But within that we need education and awareness. So we need industry, we need bosses, we need health and safety representatives and workers all trained in fatigue and taking it seriously. And again, if there's specific tasks where fatigue is going to be an issue or where those tasks cause fatigue, then perhaps there should be specific training for those involved with those tasks. And incident management. So if an incident occurs, work-related fatigue needs to be investigated as a contributor to it, and that's both internally and externally. The example given just earlier on the Australian investigation into the truck accident is a great example, but we know that that's not happening in New Zealand as an across-the-board practice. And so we say that all accidents need to be investigated through a fatigue lens, looking at the hazard factors that I set out before. All those factors need to be looked at when you're investigating accidents. As we also talked about, we've got brand new health and safety laws coming in, and I'm really looking forward to working with Downer on some fatigue regulations. That will be fantastic. And we should look at putting what we've just talked about into perhaps some approved codes of practice or guidance, and it should be included in ACC as well. So there we go, that's my very quick rush on the simple solution to fatigue. This is an issue we need to take seriously. It's systemic and the answer isn't simple, but it can be managed and its impact can be reduced. So thank you very much.